Hey guys, this is Dan. I just did a code review for a client and the topic of testing Python command line applications came up. And I think there's not a lot of information about that out there, but command line applications are relatively easy to put under test. Compared to GUI applications, it's a lot easier to test a command line application when it comes to unit tests and when it comes to also integration or integration style tests. And there are some techniques that I personally use that I never really talked about before. So I wanted to give you some pointers and just kind of show you how I approach testing command line apps in this video. So what I've got here is a command line app that I built for myself. So it's basically a little daemon or like a little application that runs in the background all the time on my home server, and it sorts photos that I upload into a folder structure in the way that I like, right? So what this program does isn't really important, but just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. So it ensures that this directory structure exists and kind of sorts my photos in there, whatever source they're from. If I upload them from my camera or my phone, they just kind of go into an inbox folder, and then that script puts them into the right place. So this is a command that runs like a background service, and it's listening for file changes here, and then it's sorting these files and putting them in the right place. So this application, it's a command line tool, right? It doesn't have any GUI. Like the way you run it is just from the command line, and it keeps running in the background. So it's a relatively simple command line application, but it also has fairly good test coverage, right? So it's not excellent, but it covers all the basics. And for like a one-off tool like that, I think that's okay. So I'm using some techniques here to put this application under test that I want to show you, because they're pretty generic and you could apply them to other command line applications or Python command line applications as well. So the first thing that I want to show you here, this is like the main script here, or this is just one file. It has the main entry point down here, which is a main method, and this is one of my test beds for playing with mypy, so you can disregard these type annotations. If you want to know what these type annotations are about, I've got a video that's a quick intro to mypy, so you might want to check that out. Everyone else, just ignore them for now. So what you can see here, this is a main function, and this main function gets called whenever we run this file as a command line script or as a standalone Python program. And what I'm doing here is I have the standard boilerplate that checks thunder name to figure out if this was imported as a module or if it is meant to be executed as a command line script or a program. And what I do here, instead of just calling main, I call sysexit on the return value of main, so I can return an error code if I want to. And I'm passing sysargv to main, which means main doesn't actually access sysargv directly, but it just kind of runs with the argument vector I pass in. And this may look like a really small change, but it's actually quite powerful, because what you can see here in this main method, it parses out the arguments with this parseArgs method. And I'm using argparse here in this argparse method, but I'm parsing out the argument vector that gets passed to main and then gets passed to this function. So I'm building these functions, these little building blocks, in a way that allows them to be tested independently, right? So I don't want to access sysargv directly, but I want to have a main method that gets past an argument vector, and then it's doing everything else it needs. And then at the end, it returns an error code, right? If everything works well or worked fine, then we're just going to return 0. What this allows me to do, if I switch back to the tests here for a moment, what this allows me to do, it lets me write almost an integration test for this whole application. And instead of having to spin that up from an external script, right, where it would have to run python sorter.py, I can actually call the main function and pass it an argument vector, an argv, that I just defined within the test. So in this case, I'm making sure that if I pass an argument vector that doesn't have the necessary command line parameters, we raise an exception and leave the app, right? So I make sure this raises system exit. Ideally, I would probably just check the return code, but this script isn't perfect yet, or this program isn't perfect yet. So there's actually the point in there where it calls sysexit. But you can get a feeling for this general approach here, right? And then also I can test this parseArgs method, and I can make sure that if I pass it an argument vector, it's parsing out the source folder and the destination folder correctly. And you could write these tests and actually exercise the whole application, this whole tool, by calling into the main method without having to write a shell script that runs this command a bunch of times. So this gives you, if you structure your main method in that fashion, or structure the entry point for your script in that fashion, it gives you a lot of power what you can do in terms of testing. So that's the one thing that I usually do when I'm testing scripts like that, right? And something else that's difficult when testing command line tools is that they often deal with the file system, right? Like if you have some kind of build script or some script that generates an output file, does some data crunching, it often involves interacting with the file system. And this stuff is kind of hard to test. So let me show you an example here. So in this case, this tool, it needs to move files around, right? Because it's sorting these files and it's moving around files. And so for example, I've got this move file function here that takes a root folder and then a target path and does a bunch of validation, and then actually calls the shellutil.move command, or the shellutil.move function, because this is a great way to make this these file system operations agnostic to the operating system we're running on, right? Like I'm not doing an OS system and calling the copy command, for example, or the move command. I'm using the shellutil move function to move those files around. And now the question is, how do you test that behavior? Well, so the first trick here was to actually use shellutil.move instead of calling out an external command to do the file move. And then the second trick is in the tests to use mocking. So I'm importing unittest.mock here. And when we find this test for the move file function that I just showed you, you can see here that it's mocking out these file system functions. And by mocking, I mean it's replacing them with a fake object that can be used in a similar fashion, but actually doesn't do anything. So this is called mocking. And what you can see here is that I'm using the mock.patch functionality to temporarily patch this shellutil.move and the os.makeDirs function. And then my test gets passed a mock object. And now I can call the move file function, and I can query these mock objects and make sure they were called with the right parameters. So the thinking here is that there isn't really a point for testing whether the shellutil.move command actually moves a file around. You know, this is code that has been exercised millions, billions of times because Python is so widespread. And we can just assume that the standard library works as intended here. And I'm just replacing those functions with mock functions or mock objects that I can then make sure were called with the right arguments. And I would just assume that if this was a real program run and not just a test run, or not just a test, that Python would do the move correctly. And this is very powerful because when I'm testing this code here, this move file command, I'm not checking if the files were actually copied around on the file system. I'm just checking whether the right levers were pushed, right? Like whether we called out to this shellutil.move function in the right way and gave it the right arguments. And this makes these tests, A, run faster because they're not actually moving stuff around, and B, it's easier to maintain because I don't have to have like a full test harness with, dummy images that I can move around. Like I actually do that here as well for this project. I have some files that are actually being moved around and like some real files that are being parsed in. But for this particular unit test, I went down the mocking route. And I find that that is a really helpful technique if you're working with any kind of file system operation, which often happens in these command line tools. So there were two tricks in this video here. Number one was how to structure your main method and your script entry point so that it can be easier tested, almost like an integration test. And number 2 was how to use mocking to test file system operations or to test functions that deal with file system operations that are a little bit harder to test if you want to actually execute them. All right, so I hope this gave you some ideas on how to potentially refactor your Python command line tools. And if you want to actually take a look at this code, just take this as an example to base your own command line tools on, feel free to do that. So this is all open source. You can find it at github.com/debater/photosorter. And I'm going to put a comment in the description there. And it's a pretty basic project, pretty basic command line tool. Like I said, it has automated tests and kind of all of the plumbing set up for you. Now, this is a little bit older, right? So you might want to update the dependencies and stuff. But the general approach, I think, is still very valid. Like mainly, having a clear entry point that you can test and then using mocking. I feel like this stuff, you can kind of adapt that one-to-one to your own projects. All right, well, I hope this was helpful. So have fun trying this out. If you want more Python tips and tutorials just like that, then subscribe to my channel or check out debater.org, where I publish new Python tutorials and articles every week. And I've also got a newsletter where you can get Python tricks to your inbox every couple of days. So if you're interested in improving your Python skills, then check that out. And I'll talk to you soon. And in the meantime, happy Pythoning.